Bump in the night, bump in the night, at Halloween you'll squeal with fright. Bump in the night, bump in the night, keep those lanterns burning bright. Out in the night, out in the night, ghosts and witches float into sight. Out in the night, out in the night, keep those lanterns burning bright. Bump in the night, bump in the night, at Halloween you'll squeal with fright. Bump in the night, bump in the night, keep those lanterns burning bright. Can you join in with me? Bump in the night, bump in the night, at Halloween you'll squeal with fright. Bump in the night, bump in the night, keep those lanterns burning bright. Out in the night, out in the night, ghosts and witches float into sight. Out in the night, out in the night, keep those lanterns burning bright. Bump in the night, bump in the night, at Halloween you'll squeal with fright. Bump in the night, bump in the night, keep those lanterns burning bright. Welcome, welcome to my Samhain, to my Halloween home. The days are growing shorter and colder, the nights longer and darker, and we've reached Halloween, the time of year when the veil between the world of the living and the dead is at its thinnest. It's the time when we carve pumpkins with all types of designs on them. It's the time when we dress up as ghosts and ghouls and goblins, as witches and wizards and vampires. And we might even go out trick or treating. I'm Noel the Storyteller, and I'm going to share several stories with you, all about strange creatures and uncanny things. But before I do that, I have a riddle for you. Can you figure out what the answer is? I have a gift that cannot be broken or destroyed. The more you give it away, the better it is, for it can bring a smile to a face or a tear to an eye. It can be long or short, old or new, so pass it on and keep it too. I'll tell you it one more time. I have a gift that cannot be broken or destroyed. The more you give it away, the better it is, because it can bring a smile to a face or a tear to an eye. It can be long or short, old or new, so pass it on and keep it too. Riddle me, ree, what do you think the answer might be? Have a talk to the people you're listening with. You might even want to pause the recording for a moment. Have you got any idea what it could be? It's something very, very precious. Okay, I'll tell you. It's a story. Stories really are the greatest of gifts, because they can take us into a world of our imagination. And in our imaginations, anything is possible. I'm going to tell you my very first story. The very first story, all about a young man by the name of Alexander. Once, there was a young man by the name of Alexander who was on a journey through a deep, dark wood. Well, he'd grown tired, and so he decided to sit down and rest his back against the trunk of a tree. And he looked into his pack. In his pack, he had a simple chunk of bread and a little cheese. And he was just about to devour his lunch when all of a sudden there was a flash of green light. And there in front of him was the strangest looking little man, who was clad entirely from head to toe in green, with a little green cap and a green jacket. And he looked at Alexander and he said, I don't suppose you could spare a few coins, could you? And Alexander looked at him and he said, I'm very sorry, I don't have any money myself. I'm actually on my way to the neighbouring village to see if I can get some work. But what you can do is you could share my lunch. Well, the old dwarf, he sat down with Alexander, and he gratefully and hungrily ate his share of the bread and cheese. And then he smiled at Alexander, and he doffed his cap, and he clapped his hands, and he disappeared. A few moments later, Alexander felt the ground beginning to shake. And he realised somebody else was approaching him. And it was a horrible, huge, ugly, great troll wife. And she looked at him and she said, "You're in my wood. What are you doing in my wood?" And he said, I'm very sorry. I don't mean any harm. I'm just passing through." "And I shan't mean any harm when I put you in my pot and cook you up and eat you." "No, please don't do that. I've got a wife and 5 children. What would they do without me?" "Well, all right. I'll play a little game with you. I'll give you 3 chances to hide from me. And if I catch you 3 times, it's into my pot you'll go." And then she stomped away. Poor Alexander, he just stood there thinking, well, where can I hide? I don't really know these woods very well. But fortunately, just then, there was a flash of green light again, and there stood the dwarf. The dwarf said, "I'll help you. I'll help you. Alexander, I'll help you." And then the dwarf, he took an axe and he chipped away at some of the bark on the trunk of the tree where Alexander had been resting. And from it he fashioned a door, and he was able to open that door. And he said, hide inside there, my friend." And so Alexander, he hid inside the hollow of the log, and then he waited. It wasn't long before he felt the ground shaking once more, and he heard a voice. "Gonna fell me a tree, fell me a tree. We'll see what I see when I fell me a tree." It was the troll wife returning, and over her shoulder she had a huge axe. And she went straight to the tree in which Alexander was hiding, and she picked up the axe and she swung that axe over her shoulder, and soon the tree was swaying, and then it came crashing down to the ground. And as soon as the trunk of the tree hit the ground, the door burst open, and the troll wife, she grabbed Alexander out, and she said, that's once I've caught you." And then she stomped away. Poor Alexander thought, she found me so easily. Where can I hide now? Well, fortunately, the green dwarf appeared once more, and he said, "We shall have to hide you much better this time. We shall have to hide you much, much better. Now come with me, my friend." And he led Alexandra along a path through the woods, and they went across the little bridge beneath which there was a babbling brook, and they came to a lake. And then the dwarf, he bent down and he cut one of the reeds, and then he tapped Alexander on the shoulder with it. And then Alexander, he began to shrink, and he grew smaller and smaller and smaller, so small in fact that he could be picked up by the dwarf, and the dwarf popped him into the reed and blew a little. And then he put that reed back in amongst the other reeds there on the edge of the lake. And then he disappeared. But soon, Alexander heard the sound of the troll wife again. Well, she was singing, "Gonna cut me some reeds, we'll see what I see when I cut down these reeds." And she brought a knife and she went whoosh, 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 and she cut through the reeds, and then she shook each and every reed until from out of the reeds fell Alexander, and as soon as his tiny body hit the earth beneath, he began to grow once more. And the troll wife looked at him and she said, "Once, twice I've caught you. When I catch you the next time, it's into my pot you'll go." And now Alexander began to sob. "What can I do? I don't know how I'll hide. I don't know what to do so that she can't find me." But once again the dwarf appeared and he said, "Don't worry, my friend. This time we'll get the better of her." And then he said some magical words, and Alexander was transformed into a great trout, which just for a moment or two was flapping there upon the ground next to the reeds. But then the dwarf, he picked him up and he threw him into the cool, clear water, and he said, "Swim, my friend. Swim away, my friend." And Alexander could feel the cool, cool water running through his gills, and he swam out into the lake. A few moments later, the troll wife returned. "Gonna catch me a fish, catch me a fish. It'll make a tasty dish when I catch me a fish." And she was carrying a great big washing tub, and in it 2 small oars and a fishing rod. And she pushed that wash tub out into the water, and she picked up the oars and she began to row. Now, standing on the banks of the lake stood the dwarf, and he filled up his lungs and he blew once, twice, 3 times, and then the still lake water began to bubble and boil, and the wind grew stronger and stronger, and then the rain began to fall down, and the bathtub began to rock this way and that, and water began to spill into the wash tub, and the old troll wife cried out, "Help me! Help me!" But the water carried on spilling in, and then the whole thing capsized and sank to the very, very bottom of that lake. And she was never seen again. But the dwarf, he looked out and he beckoned. He beckoned, and then Alexander, he swam. He swam to the shore, and as soon as his shimmering body hit the shoreline, he found himself growing once more back to his normal size. And there he stood, quite dry, beside the dwarf. And the dwarf looked at him and he said, "I thank you kindly for sharing your food with me." And Alexander was about to say, and I thank you for saving my life." But then he realised the dwarf had disappeared. And so Alexander carried on his way, and what a story he had to tell. All about how his act of kindness had in fact saved his very life. I'm glad Alexander escaped, aren't you? Now the next story I'm going to tell you is all about somebody who's really mischievous. Perhaps you're a bit of a trickster. Perhaps you're the mischief maker in your family, or maybe you know somebody else's. Anyway, this is a story all about a girl who's very mischievous. Once there was a very mischievous girl who loved nothing better than scaring her younger brother to death. You see, the trouble was, he annoyed her. What he loved to do was he loved to sit right in front of the television. And even though it was a widescreen, he'd sit so close to the television that she wouldn't be able to see properly. Well, She'd ask him nicely. She'd ask him nicely if he'd move back a little bit, but he'd ignore her. And then she'd try and shove him and push him to get him out of the way, but that somehow didn't seem to work either. And so what she did then was she decided just to let him concentrate. And when she was certain he was fully focused on his program, and maybe it was something like Thunderbirds, she would slowly creep up on him and she'd go, "Boo!" And then he'd jump into the air and he'd very nearly hit his head on the roof. And then she'd wait a little while until he was watching really intently again, and she'd creep up on him and she'd go, "Boo!" And once again he'd nearly hit his head on the roof. Well, eventually it got late, and the younger brother, he went upstairs to bed, and the older brother went upstairs to bed, and the girl's parents went upstairs to bed, and she went upstairs to bed. And in her room, she lay down in her bed, and she pulled up her duvet, and she lay there. And outside she could hear the wind blowing, and she could hear the rustling of the trees, and then she heard a scratching sound. And she wondered what it was, and so she jumped out of bed and she went up to the curtains and she pulled back the curtains, and there, staring in at her, she saw a hideous creature. Well, it had wild hair that stood up in every direction. It had a pointed chin with bristles on it. It had a crooked nose, and on the end of the nose was a wart, and growing out of the wart 3 greasy black hairs. And then it looked at her and it said, do you know what I do with my long red fingernail and my big red lips?" And she said, no, I don't know, and I don't want to know. And she ran back to her bed, and she jumped into her bed, and she pulled up her duvet. She tried to get to sleep. The next day at school, she forgot all about the hideous creature. And when she got home, she began to think about the next trick she wanted to play. Because apart from scaring her younger brother to death, she also liked to make her older brother feel sick to the stomach. You see, her older brother was always nagging her. You know how it is sometimes with older brothers and sisters. And he picked on her and he called her Pipsqueak and Shorthouse. And so she decided she was going to play a trick on him. Well, they were sitting down at the dinner table, and I think they were having something like fish fingers and chips and peas, or maybe it was burger and chips and peas. But anyway, she was shoveling the peas into her mouth, and she was chewing them up good and proper. And then she looked at her brother when her mum was turned away, and she went, "Blah!" And there was that horrible green gooey mess in her mouth, and it made him feel sick to the stomach, and he had to run away from the table. And maybe he was even sick. Well, later that night, the older brother went upstairs to bed, and the younger brother went upstairs to bed, and the mother and the father, they went upstairs to bed, and the mischievous girl went upstairs to bed. And there she was laying in her bed, and she pulled the quilt up to her chin, and once again, she could hear the sound of the wind. She could hear the rustling of the trees, and then she heard it for a second time. That scratching at the window. And even though she had a sense of what it might be, she couldn't help herself. She got up and she went to the window and she pulled back the curtains, and there it was, the hideous creature. And you know what it looked like? It had hair that stuck out in every direction. It had a pointy chin with bristles on it. It had a long, crooked nose, and on the end of the nose, a wart, and growing out of the wart, 3 greasy hairs. And it looked at her, and it said, do you know what I do with my long red fingernail and my big red lips. And she said, no, I don't know, and I don't want to know. And she ran back to her bed, and she jumped into her bed, and she pulled up a quilt, and this time she even hid underneath her pillow. The next day at school, she was uncharacteristically quiet. She hardly said a thing. She didn't interrupt the teachers. She didn't even really spend much time arguing with the other children. And when she came home, she was also very quiet until she thought about the third thing she'd love to do best in all the world. And that was getting her parents to say something rude. And so she said to her mum and dad as they sat at the dining table, I bet you a £5 I can get you to say something rude, something impolite. I bet I can really annoy you. Well, the truth was sometimes she did annoy them, but they didn't want to admit to it, and they said, no, darling, we never get impolite. We're never rude. And so, are you going to take my bet then? Are you going to bet me a £5? Oh, very well, they said. And then she said to them, Pete and Repeat were sitting on the fence. Pete fell off, who was left? And the mother and the father looked at one another and said, Repeat. Oh, Repeat. Pete and Repeat were sitting on the fence. Pete fell off, who was left? Repeat. All right, Repeat. Pete and Repeat were sitting on the fence. Pete fell off. Who was left? Oh, for goodness sake, Repeat, will you give over? I told you you'd be rude. I told you you'd get cross. Pay me my £5. And so, the mother and the father, they had to give her a £5. And then the mother and the father, they went upstairs to bed. And the older brother, he went upstairs to bed, and so did the younger brother. And eventually, the mischievous girl went up to bed. And she got into bed, and she pulled the cover up to her chin, and she lay there, and she could hear the sound of the wind. She could hear the trees rustling, and then she heard it again. That scratching at the window. And so she got up. She went to the window, she pulled back the curtains, and there it was, that hideous creature with the hair that stuck out in every direction, the chin with the bristly hairs, that creature with a crooked nose and the wart with 3 greasy hairs growing out of it. And it looked at her and it said, do you know what I do with my long red fingernail and my big red lips? And she looked at it and she said, every night you come back here and it's always the same old question. Do I know what you do with your long red fingernail and your red lips? Well, no, I don't know. And so I guess you just better show me. And so it looked at her and it said, did I catch you out? Or did you know? I hope if you knew you didn't give it away. I've got one final story to share with you. But before I tell you this final story, riddle me this. A feline friend or a fearsome foe, the Egyptians honoured me, you know. I stalk my prey with keen desire, then return home to curl up by the fire. A feline friend or a fearsome foe, the Egyptians honoured me, you know. I stalk my prey with keen desire, then return home to curl up by the fire. Have a little think. Have you figured out what it is already? Yeah, have a chat with whoever's listening with you. It's a cat, isn't it? A cat. And my final story is all about one very special cat. Johnny Reed. Johnny Reed had a hard job to do. It was a tiring job. But it was work that was always needed, because Johnny Reed was a grave digger. And he worked for the parson, he worked for the priest at the local cemetery. And each and every day he'd dig deeply into the ground and he'd prepare the graves for the coffins, so that the coffins could be lowered there into the grave, and then people could come and say their prayers of respect for the dead. Well, Johnny Reed had been working hard. It had been a summer day and there'd been many, many graves to dig. But there was still one to complete, and so he'd been digging all day. And by now it was growing quite late and he was feeling quite tired, but he knew he had to complete this final grave, because the next day a coffin was going to be laid in it and the priest was going to say some words for the gathered congregation. Well, Johnny, he thought he'd just stop for a moment, and in his waistcoat pocket he had a little flask, and he thought, because he was getting tired and because it would be nice to have something to warm himself as it grew a little cooler, he had a wee little sip of whiskey. And then, I don't know if it's because he'd been working hard all day, but he fell fast asleep. When he woke up, he realised he was looking up and there were stars and a moon in the night sky, and he realised that he'd fallen asleep there in the bottom of the grave. And as he came to his senses, he heard the strangest sound. 1 step, 2 step, 3 step, meow. 1 step, 2 step, 3 step, meow. He hauled himself up, and now he was peering over the rim of the grave, and just coming down the path through the cemetery, he saw a strange procession. There, coming towards him, were 6 black cats, each wearing top hats, and upon their shoulder was rested a coffin, and on the top of that coffin was a crown, and the cat that was leading the way was looking straight at Johnny Reed, and it had its eyes firmly fixed on him. 1 step, 2 step, 3 step, meow. 1 step, 2 step, 3 step, meow. It grew closer and closer, and now Johnny was feeling very uneasy. He'd never seen anything so strange in all his life. And then the procession stopped in front of him, and the lead cat said, tell Dildrum that Doldrum is dead. Tell Dildrum that Doldrum is dead. Johnny, he looked at the cat, a speaking cat, and then he watched as the procession turned away and began to take another path. 1 step, 2 step, 3 step, meow. Well, I can tell you, as soon as they were out of sight, he hauled himself out of that grave and he ran. He ran as fast as he could, out of the cemetery gate and down the lane, all the way down back to his own little cottage. And when he opened the door, he heaved a sigh of relief, because everything appeared to be as normal. There was Mary, his wife, knitting away. There was his dog, Rover, sitting, licking himself. And there in front of his fire was his cat, Old Tom. And he burst over and he said, Mary, you won't believe what I saw. I saw the most uncanny thing. The uncanny thing as I was finishing off the last grave tonight. And she said, really, Johnny? What was it you saw? I hope you haven't been at the whiskey again. Well, yes, I did have a little drop, but it was so odd. And I've heard all manner of things, and I've seen some strange things, but this was the strangest thing I've ever seen. I saw 6 black cats. At this point, old Tom, who had been happily snoring away in front of the fire, stirred and looked up at Johnny. Yes, 6 black cats, and those 6 blacks, they were wearing black top hats, and they were carrying a coffin. A coffin? Really? Said Mary. Johnny, are you sure you weren't dreaming this? No, I saw it as plain as day. And then they were marching towards me. 1 step, 2 step, 3 step, meow. And the lead cat was looking at me, really odd, really strangely. And then he realised that old Tom was always also looking at him. And old Tom was peering at him curiously. That lead cat was looking at me just like old Tom. And then they stopped in front of me, Mary, and the lead cat spoke, Mary. It spoke to me, Mary, and it said, "Tell Dildrum that Doldrum is dead. Tell Dildrum that Doldrum is dead." But I don't know who Dildrum is. I don't know who Doldrum is. And then Mary said, Johnny, look at old Tom. And old Tom had got up onto his feet, and he was peering peculiarly at Johnny. And Johnny said, but I don't know who Dildrum is. I don't know who the Doldrum is. But then the cat, old Tom, said, Doldrum is dead. Doldrum is dead. Well, in that case, I'm king of the cats. And he disappeared up the chimney. And he was never, ever seen again. But if you ever see a cat wearing a crown, maybe you've found old Tom, or Dildrum, who is king of the cats. Now, I've been Noel the Storyteller. I hope you've enjoyed the stories. And I hope that when it comes to celebrating Halloween, you'll do it in the way that brings you the greatest joy and fun. Maybe you'll carve a pumpkin like this one. Maybe you'll dress up and have a party. Maybe you're going to do some drawings and sketches. It would be lovely, you know, if you wanted to share your favourite Halloween stories with me. Maybe do some pictures, some images of some of the different things you've imagined as I've told the tales. And so, I'm going to leave you with one last thing. And here on my YouTube site, I wonder if you could give me the answer to this final riddle. And it links into the last story I told. The man who made it didn't want it. The man who bought it didn't use it. The man who used it didn't see it. I'll do it one last time. The man who made it didn't want it. The man who bought it didn't use it. The man who used it didn't see it. Riddle me, ree. What do you think the answer might be? And so, now I'd just like to say, bump in the night, at Halloween you'll squeal with fright. Bump in the night, keep those lanterns burning bright. Farewell.